Welcome on this December 14th, 1995, to the second in our series of interviews with the Reverend Dr. Harold L. Mitton, former principal and professor at Acadia Divinity College. Dr. Mitton, in our first interview, you told us about coming to Acadia and your opportunities of leadership that you had here. There are just two things I wonder if you could, first of all, fill out a little bit more about some of your other activities while on campus and impressions as an undergrad. And I was also struck by the fact that your brother Don also had leadership roles on the campus in those days. And tell us a little bit about him and the brotherly relationship that was yours while you were on campus.
Mm-hmm. I was quite active in what you might call Christian circles on campus. I was a member of the Student Christian Movement, the SCM as it was called in those days. And I attended on Sunday morning a mission study group taught by the professor of biology, Professor Baines. And quite frequently I would go out to represent the theological school in supplying pulpits. With reference to the SCM, I was appointed as a delegate to a quadrennial convention of the SCM movement, which convened in College of Worcester near Cleveland, Ohio. And that was a very steadying experience for me. In my junior year, Bob, I should tell you that I had a spiritual crisis. Some of the things that I was learning in philosophy and science collided head-on with some of the ideas that I had brought with me to university. And this plunged me into quite a serious crisis. And for some time I walked a lonely stretch of the agnostic road, wondering if I really believed in anything. But there came on the campus that great missionary statesman, Dr. J.B. McLaurin, and I asked for an interview with him, and I explained my predicament. And he said, well, stick to the essentials, and those areas of thought which are still in tension, just put them aside for the moment, but continue your loyalty to Christ, and you can pick up on some of these problems perhaps later. And that was very good advice, and slowly I came back to faith. But this time it was my own personal faith. From that point on, Bob, no one could laugh me out of my faith or argue me out of my faith, because it was my very own. And so while it was painful, I'm glad in many, many ways that I had that experience, because when I became a pastor and dealing with young people, I could understand some of the crises that they were going through. I was glad to have my brother Don on campus. He, as you intimated earlier, was much larger than I. He became captain of the Canadian Officers Training Corps, and he played varsity football for 4 years. Because of his weight, he was valuable in the scrum. He was elected president of our class, life president, and although we were in various different activities on campus, it was a joy really to have him on location.
Now, in the midst of our discussions, we have not talked about some aspects of your life that I think were quite important. Were you a confirmed bachelor in those days, or was there someone else in your life by this point in time?
I must have been a late bloomer, because I wasn't interested in the opposite sex until 19 or 20. That seems strange today, doesn't it? But when I went to Camp Chickadee Hawk, I met a young woman by the name of Marguerite Rideout. I discovered she had completed her second year at the University of New Brunswick. She was a member of the United Baptist Church in Heartland, and we became acquainted at that camp. I should back up for a moment, though, and say that that wasn't exactly the first time I met her. This will surprise you. We met on a gravel path at a place called Beulah, a holiness camp meeting on the banks of the St. John River. Both of us were United Baptists, but we just happened to go there because we had heard something about Beulah. And she was 18 years old at the time. And when I first met her, I stood transfixed because it was really a case of love at first sight. She was tall, beautiful eyes, curls, which fell softly on her shoulders. And I told her, of course, who I was and hoped that we would meet again. And we did meet subsequently, as I say, a few weeks later at Camp Chickadee. And I told her something of my plans, and it was from there that our relationship developed.
During those years, they often had students going out in summer ministries, and I just assume you were part of that. What did you do then during your summers when you were in university?
It was the custom in those days that pre-theology students should take what they called a summer field or a summer pastorate. The wages weren't very great. They were paid by the Home Mission Board, and I didn't think I could finance my subsequent year, my sophomore year, on the basis of such a modest salary. So I thought that I would return to Swifts for a summer job where I would receive greater compensation. But in those days, theologues were supposed at the end of the year to go and visit Dr. Ernest Mason, who was superintendent of home missions. And I went to see him and said that I wouldn't be taking a field. But then a few days later or weeks later, I felt uneasy about it, and so I went back to him. I assumed that all the summer fields were then assigned, but he said, sit down. He was kind of a gruff man. He said, sit down. And he said, I just got a letter today from a pastorate in northern New Brunswick involving 4 churches, Juniper, Bigger Ridge, Knowlesville, and Windsor. He said, would you be willing to go? And I said, yes. And so I went to Juniper. I went, first of all, of course, to my home in Moncton, and took the train to McGivney Junction. And who should meet me there but you, John Fleming, who was later the Premier, or the Premier of New Brunswick, and still later the Member of Parliament for Carleton. And he took me to Juniper, and I spent my first night at his home. And then next day I sought other lodging. And Bob, I was to return to Juniper on 2 successive summers. That is to say, I was there for 3 summers going around that pastorate. And I had to have a means of conveyance. So I purchased a Harley-Davidson twin-cylinder motorcycle, which caused quite a sensation on the pastorate. And later I was able to purchase a Model A Ford, which wasn't in very good shape, but at least it got me around the pastorate. And those were great days. I appreciated the kindness of the people in those 4 communities.
Now, obviously you must have found enough money somewhere to keep going. Was it just from the church, or were you working at other things?
No, I was very fortunate. There was a mill, the Fleming Gibson Mill in Juniper, which was the largest hardwood exporting firm, I think, perhaps in eastern Canada. And at the end of each summer, the joint owners of the mill, Mr. Fleming and his brother Weldon and Sam Billings, they got together a purse of $400 or $500 and gave it to me prior to my coming back to Acadia. And I think what they appreciated was, as a student pastor, I identified myself, especially in Juniper, with those who worked in the mill. It was a big mill, and I used to go in and eat with the men at the big cookhouse, and even stand on the carrier of the sawyer when his machine ripped through the logs. And it was my identification with the people that impressed the owners of the mill. And Hugh John Fleming became my lifelong friend. He was superintendent, by the way, of the Union Church in the Sunday school in Juniper, and never missed a Sunday at church in the 3 summers I was there.
You might be just interested to know that my wife, Myrna, taught DVBS for his son, Hugh John Jr.
Yes.
And they were kind enough to send a gift to our wedding and that kind of
Isn't that
thing. So
interesting?
it's an interesting contact.
Yes.
What about your relationship with Marguerite through these years? Did you get to see her, and how was that worked out for you?
Well, when I was told by Dr. Mason about this opening, I didn't fully realize that I would only be about 20 miles from Marguerite's home. And so during those 3 summers when I was pastor on that Juniper field, occasionally I would go into Heartland, and our relationship was deepened in that way, that it provided me with a wonderful opportunity to see her and to see her mother, who was a widow. They lived on a farm in Heartland, overlooking the mighty St. John River, and I loved to go in and visit in that home.
Now, when were you married? Before you went on to seminary, or after you started?
Yes, after I was graduated from Acadia, we were married in Heartland on August the 9th, 1944, by the Reverend Harry Taylor. And it was a very beautiful summer day, and we honeymooned in a place near Plaster Rock at a gull quack fishing lodge, which was operated by my uncle Henry. And it was there in the beauty of that forest that after a busy time of wedding preparations, that we had the opportunity to reflect upon God's goodness to us.
And so you began seminary in that fall, and did you just go straight through?
Yes. I came back to the School of Theology and began my studies for the Bachelor of Divinity degree. You might wonder how we financed this. I had been asked by Dr. Patterson to be field secretary for Acadia University during my summers, and in that way I earned some money. And Marguerite joined the staff of Horton Academy on the campus and taught there during my years of theological study, and in that way we were able to manage our affairs. If I could cut back a bit, I would like to acknowledge how much I owe to Dr. F.W. Patterson, the president of the university. As I said, he took a very deep personal interest in me, and I learned so much from him by way of diplomacy and good study habits. He became really one of my chief mentors at Acadia, and I owe a great deal to him.
I wonder if you could tell us who the professors were at the School of Theology in those days and your impressions of the education that you were receiving.
Yes, there weren't a great number of students enrolled in theology in those days in what was called the School of Theology of Acadia University. We had 4 professors. Dr. Gordon Warren was the dean, and incidentally I never dreamed that I would follow Dr. Warren in 2 situations. He was pastor at Brunswick Street at one time, and of course dean, and I never dreamed as I sat in his classes that I would ever follow him in both offices. And then there was Dr. C.B. Lumsden, who taught biblical literature and both languages, Hebrew and Greek. And incidentally, I took nearly all the courses that Dr. Lumsden offered. And then there was Dr. McGregor Fraser, who taught us the philosophy of religion and systematic theology. And the fourth member of faculty was Dr. Evan Whidden, who taught us church history. The core curriculum of the School of Theology was classical liberalism. We were introduced to German thinkers like Schleiermacher and Schopenhauer and Ritschl, and it was there that I was introduced to the historical critical method of biblical interpretation. It was tough going for me, but I owe a great deal to these four men. They were scholars, they had high ethical standards, and they demanded a great deal of their students. Particularly Dr. Lumsden wanted a student to support and document every conclusion he reached. And this helped me a great deal throughout my ministry to be quite careful in what I said and not to indulge in cliches which are so bothersome and tiresome to congregations. So while there were times when I perhaps was argumentative in class, I look back and I do appreciate what the professors did.
I wonder if there were any other things you want to mention before we just move on to talk about some of the churches in which you have served. So any other factors as you move into full-time pastoral ministry that you'd like to explore?
Yes, I'd like perhaps to review some of the influences or factors which shaped my life. First of all, I would have to acknowledge the influence of my mother. I was closer to my mother than my father. My father was very nominal at first in his commitment to Christ, but my mother was a deeply spiritual woman and taught both Don and me to pray and to read the scriptures and to tithe. I had a newspaper route and I was encouraged to give a tenth of what I earned. I put it in a discarded cigar box and the money later found its way into the church. I've mentioned the influence of A.K. Herman and Andrew G., Deacon Chester Eagles. I owe a great deal to these people for the way they shaped my life. But it was when I was 16, when Andrew G., the Chinese evangelist, came on the scene, that I began to have deep spiritual hungers. And there was an emphasis, Bob, in those days on what they called the deeper life. You were supposed to, perhaps following commitment, to go on to experience more and more of the power of the Spirit. And I began to examine three movements in those days. I suppose they could be called dispensationalism, perfectionism, and Pentecostalism. Would you be interested in my thoughts about these?
Yes, I would be, because that whole era sees a reshaping of Baptists, and they go in a variety of directions.
First of all, dispensationalism. There was a teacher of the adult class in Highfield by the name of Mr. B.O. Bates. He was president of, or manager of, the telephone company in Moncton. And through the influence of some man by the name of Darby, he began to encourage the use of the Schofield Reference Bible with its emphasis on dispensations. So I was introduced to that. But I later began to believe that the Bible should be interpreted historically and Christocentrically. So I moved away from that emphasis. Then came perfectionism. I was, for a time, influenced by the holiness movement as it was represented by the Reformed Baptists, as they were known in those days, and they emphasized what they called entire sanctification. And through this experience, one was supposed to be delivered from the old nature and even the possibility of sinning. And this I began to see didn't ring true to my experience anyway, and I began to see that the Christian life was a process, and that one had to grow in grace, and that there was no experience this side of the grave that would deliver one once and for all from the old nature. So I came through that period, and then came to Pentecostalism. The charismatic movement was quite strong in those days, and some of my friends said to me, "Harold, you should seek the baptism of the Holy Spirit." So I was quite intent on receiving all that God wanted me to have, but I never received any of the sign gifts, as earnest as I was. And so I came to believe that each believer is baptized with the Holy Spirit, and that one, of course, should at all times seek the empowering of the Spirit. But those were the three influences in my early Christian life: dispensationalism, perfectionism, and Pentecostalism. But these were brief encounters, you might say. But I'd have to say, in all honesty, and maybe you don't like to hear this, I don't know, that not everything in my spiritual upbringing was helpful. There was a sort of an emphasis on legalism, and there were a lot of prohibitions. And then there was the emphasis on the separated life. And this had the effect of making me feel extremely awkward if I ventured forth into the world. Mind you, it had its points. And then there was an emphasis, it seemed to me, on what somebody has called worm theology. Oh, to be nothing, nothing, nothing. And it took me a long time to realize, Bob, that the entrance of Christ into my life led not to its diminishment, but to its enlargement and enrichment. So, but on the whole, I would have to say, and I want to make this very clear, that I am grateful for my evangelical heritage. The person of Jesus Christ has never ceased to be real to me through these years, and as a result of his hold upon my life, I've been saved from many pitfalls. And I think I carried right through into my life and into my ministry a certain moral earnestness and a warmth and a passion that I never would have had I not come through these formative influences upon my life. Now, that's a rather long answer to your question, but as I reflect, this is what helped to shape my life.
Dr. Mitton, I wonder if we could pursue this just a little more, because I'm really interested in how we are shaped out of our beginnings. There was also a movement called the Oxford movement that had been shaped a bit by the Keswick movement that's influential at the same point in time. And there were people traveling through North America, particularly from Britain. Did you have any exposure to that movement as well, that call to the holy life?
Not particularly, Bob, through the Oxford group movement, although I was, I suppose, exposed to that. But coming back, as I frequently do, to Andrew G., I believe that he came out of the Keswick movement. Mm-hmm. And so there was this strong emphasis on the deeper life of one going forward in one's Christian life. I think perhaps the danger or the weakness sometimes in Baptist churches, we stress the once and for all nature of conversion as if there was nothing to follow. And so I did appreciate the emphasis on the deeper life and of going forward to experience more of the empowering of the Holy Spirit, which has been central in my ministry ever since.
May I ask one other question that I think relates to this, the question of dispensationalism, because I grew up in the same kind of milieu. And in terms of your own preaching ministry, how did you handle the second coming? Did you adopt some view of eschatology, or did you just handle it as the great hope? I'm curious as to how you handle that in your preaching ministry.
Well, that's a difficult question. When I came to Calgary, the congregation, I think, expected me to preach a series of sermons on the end times, because many members of the First Baptist Church Calgary had transferred from Eberhardt's assembly, and they seemed to want sermons on the book of Daniel and Revelation almost non-stop. And while I believed and still believe in the Second Advent, I tended to paint that event in broad strokes rather than going into details. I had been wearied of that in my Highfield experience, when evangelists would come along and identify the Antichrist in terms of historical figures, and one after another of whom passed away, and it left the whole matter in a state of disrepute as far as I was concerned. So that I handled my preaching on the Second Advent in a different way than I had been introduced in the Scofield Reference Bible.
If I might follow this up, I remember Stuart Murray showing me his Scofield Reference Bible from essentially the same days, well marked up, although he moved from that. You and Stuart grew up in the same church. I wonder if you want to make a comment about your relationship and over the years.
Yes, I was hoping you'd ask me that, Bob, because I regard Stuart Murray as one of the most colorful leaders our denomination has produced. He and his family came from Louisville over to Highfield. I remember his father, Sid Murray, and his mother, who was, I think, formerly Miss Seeley, whose father was a pastor. And Stuart became a very resourceful person. He was certainly bright intellectually, had all kinds of skills, could be abrupt at times, but we grew up together. I think likely he forsook dispensationalism somewhere along the way as well, but it was always a joy for Stuart and I to get together across the years because of our common heritage in Highfield.
Dr. Mitton, we appreciate your willingness to share with us, and your story of your early life is fascinating, and we look forward to our next interview when we can explore some of your ministry experiences. Thank you very much.
Thank you.